The music
I
was
made this
loud,
for
the
you.
lights were
Oh, it's
bright,
beautiful.
and
Thank
laughter
you,
filled
dear.
every
I
corner
will
of the
treasure
grand
it.
wedding hall. But somehow, one man seemed invisible. He sat quietly near the back, his wheelchair tucked beside a pillar, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that no one bothered to notice. Guests passed by him without a glance, their eyes drawn instead to gold decorations, expensive gifts, and the powerful families seated up front. No one knew or cared that this ignored man was a disabled millionaire, someone whose name once commanded respect far beyond these walls. This wedding was meant to be a celebration of love, status, and pride. It belonged to a powerful family, the kind that measured worth by appearances and influence. To them, a man who could not stand on his own feet was easy to overlook, no matter how calm his eyes were or how much quiet dignity he carried. Whispers floated through the hall about business deals, inheritances, and alliances, but none of them mentioned the silent guest by the wall. Even the groom, busy accepting praise, never once turned his head in that direction. The disabled millionaire had come alone. He wasn't here for attention or sympathy. His presence was tied to an old promise, a past kindness, something most people had long forgotten. As he watched the crowd, his thoughts drifted far from the wedding stage. He remembered a time before the accident, before the wheelchair, when people rushed to shake his hand, instead of walking past him. Today, those same kind of people brushed by him as if he were part of furniture. Not far away, the staff moved quietly, trained to blend into background. Among them was a maid, dressed simply, her eyes always lowered. She had brought her young daughter with her, a small girl who clutched her mother's hand and looked around the hall with wide, curious eyes. Unlike the adults, the child noticed everything. She noticed the flowers, the cake, the music. And she noticed the man everyone else ignored. While the guests laughed and posed for photos, the little girl kept glancing toward the corner. She saw the way people avoided the man's eyes. She saw how he smiled politely when someone accidentally bumped into his wheelchair, only to be brushed off without an apology. Something about that didn't sit right with her. She tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, whispering a question the maid wasn't ready to answer. As the ceremony reached its peak, applause thundered through the hall. The bride and groom stood proudly, soaking in admiration. In that noise and celebration, no one noticed a small figure stepping away from the service area. No one stopped the maid's daughter as she walked, slowly but surely, toward the disabled millionaire. What happened next would freeze the room, silence the music, and force everyone, especially those who had ignored him, to see the truth they had been blind to all along. And it would all begin with one simple, innocent gesture that no one saw coming. The girl stopped right in front of him. The noise of the wedding seemed to fade for a moment, as if the world narrowed to just the two of them. She looked up at the disabled man with calm, honest eyes, the kind that hadn't learned yet how to judge. The millionaire felt a quiet shock run through him, not because she approached, but because she wasn't afraid. She wasn't curious in a careless way. She simply stood there, as if she believed she belonged exactly where she was. Behind her, the maid froze. Her heart pounded as she realized where her daughter had gone. She took a step forward, ready to pull the child back, afraid of causing trouble in a place where people like them were expected to stay unseen. This wedding hall was not meant for mistakes. One wrong move could cost her job, the only thing standing between her family and another season of struggle. The disabled millionaire noticed the maid's panic before she reached them. He lifted a hand gently, not to stop her, but to reassure her. It was a small gesture, careful and slow, shaped by years of being misunderstood. The girl smiled, as if she sensed that kindness without needing words. She reached into her small pocket and held something tightly, waiting. The man hadn't always been invisible. Years ago, his name was printed in business magazines, spoken with admiration and envy. He built his fortune from nothing, climbing through risks and failures with relentless focus. Then came the accident, a single moment that shattered his body and rearranged his life. The wheelchair arrived, and slowly, so did the silence. Meetings stopped. Invitations faded. People who once praised his vision now spoke to his assistants instead of him. This wedding carried a connection to that past. The groom's family had once depended on the millionaire's support during a difficult time. Alone, a favor, a door open when none others were. But time had rewritten that story in their minds. Now, success made them forgetful and pride made them blind. Inviting him had been more about obligation than respect. The maid knew none of this. She only knew struggle, long hours, quiet endurance. She had taught her daughter to be polite, to stay close, to never draw attention. Yet today, something slipped through her careful rules. Maybe it was a sadness in the man's eyes. Maybe it was a loneliness that even a child could feel. Whatever it was, the girl had acted before fear could stop her. Guests nearby began to notice the pause, the strange stillness forming near the back of the hall. A few curious glances turned into whispers. Why was a staff member's child standing there? Why hadn't security stepped in? The music continued, but the mood shifted slightly, like a crack forming under polished marble. The disabled millionaire looked down at the girl's small clenched hand. He sensed that whatever she was holding mattered, not because of its value, but because of its meaning. He felt an old ache rise in his chest, a mix of gratitude and pain, stirred by the simplest attention he'd received all day. The maid finally reached them, her voice trembling as she apologized, her head bowed low. She reached for her daughter, but the girl didn't move. She opened her hand at last, revealing what she had been holding all along. And before anyone could stop what was unfolding, before the maid could pull her away, before the crowd fully understood what they were witnessing, the little girl made her gesture, one that would stir memories, awaken buried truths, and quietly threaten to expose something far bigger than anyone at that wedding was ready to face. The object resting in the girl's palm was simple, almost fragile. It was a small paper flower, folded unevenly, its edges creased from being opened and closed too many times. A thin piece of string was tied around its stem. The disabled millionaire stared at it, his breath catching for reasons he couldn't explain right away. To anyone else, it might have looked like nothing. To him, it felt like a door quietly opening somewhere deep inside. The girl held the paper flower up toward his chest, stretching on her toes. "For you," she said softly, her voice nearly lost beneath the music. "You look lonely." The word struck harder than any insult ever had. Loneliness was something he had learned to carry in silence, hidden behind polite smiles and expensive suits. He took the flower with careful fingers, as if afraid it might disappear. His eyes grew distant, pulled back into a memory he rarely allowed himself to visit. Years ago, when he was still walking, still rushing between meetings, he had stopped outside a small roadside cafe during a storm. A tired maid and her young child had been sitting there, sharing a single piece of bread. He remembered giving the child a folded paper flower, made from a napkin, just to make her smile. He hadn't thought of it again. He never knew what that small kindness had meant, or how far its echo would travel. The maid felt her stomach tighten as she watched the exchange. She didn't know why her daughter had made that flower, or why she insisted on carrying it everywhere. The girl had always said it was important, that it belonged to someone who needed it one day. The maid had smiled and nodded, thinking it was just a child's imagination. Now, doubt crept in, heavy and unsettling. Nearby, members of the groom's family began to whisper more sharply. Some recognized a man now, not by his wheelchair, but by the look on his face, the subtle authority that couldn't be erased by injury. A few uneasy glances were exchanged. Old memories stirred, mixed with guilt and fear. If he spoke, if this moment grew louder, uncomfortable questions might follow. The groom noticed a shift in the room. His smile faltered as his eyes followed the line of whispers toward the back. When he saw the disabled millionaire holding something small in his hand, surrounded by attention he hadn't planned for, irritation flared. This wasn't part of the perfect image. This wasn't supposed to matter. The disabled millionaire, meanwhile, felt a storm building quietly inside him. The paper flower trembled slightly between his fingers. It reminded him that despite everything, his wealth, his power, his loss, what endured were moments like this, unplanned, human, honest, and that realization scared him more than the stairs ever could. The maid finally knelt beside her daughter, whispering that they needed to go, that they were drawing too much attention. But the girl shook her head, her eyes fixed on the man. "He gave it to me first," she said. A long time ago. Those words rippled outward, catching the ears of people who had tried hard to forget the past. The air felt heavier now. Conversation stalled. Smiles stiffened. Somewhere between the music and the murmurs, a truth hovered, waiting for someone brave or careless enough to let it fall. And as the disabled millionaire looked up, meeting the eyes of those who had ignored him moments earlier, it became clear that this wedding was no longer just a celebration. It was turning into a reckoning, one that no amount of money, status, or silence could easily stop. Silence began to spread to the wedding hall. Slowly but unmistakably. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes when music stops, but the kind that settles when people sense something important is about to happen. The disabled millionaire felt every pair of eyes turning toward him now. Moments ago, he had been invisible. Now, he was the center of attention no one knew how to release. He lowered his gaze to the paper flower again, his thumb tracing the rough fold along its edge. His breathing grew uneven, not from weakness, but from restraint. He could feel words pressing at his chest, truths he had carried for years without an audience. Across the room, the groom's father stiffened, his face tightening as recognition finally reached him. He remembered the hospital visits after the accident, the promises made and quietly broken, the calls he stopped returning once success no longer depended on that wheelchair-bound man. The bride sensed something was wrong before anyone explained it to her. She followed her husband's line of sight, confusion creeping into her smile. She had heard stories about powerful investors and old benefactors, but none of that had mattered to her until now. The way the room felt, heavy, charged, told her this was more than a small disruption. The maid stood slowly, her hand shaking as she pulled her daughter close. She could feel judgment in the air, the unspoken rule that people like her were not meant to be part of moments like this. Fear rose in her throat, not just for her job, but for her child, who had unknowingly stepped into something much larger than herself. Yet, as she looked at the disabled man's face, she saw gratitude there, not anger, that eased her heart, even as the tension grew. Guests began murmuring openly now. Some pulled out their phones, unsure whether to record or put them away. Others leaned toward each other, piecing together fragments of memory. A few finally recognized a name whispered under breaths, the story of a self-made millionaire whose accident had cost him more than his legs. Regret flickered across faces that had once turned away from him. The disabled millionaire lifted his head at last. His eyes moved across the crowd, steady and clear. Years of being ignored had taught him patience, but also control. He adjusted his posture in the wheelchair, the small movement carrying more authority than shouting ever could. The paper flower rested in his lap now, a quiet symbol anchoring him. The groom took a step forward, then stopped. Pride battled panic on his face. If the man spoke, the carefully built image of this wedding of his family could crack in front of everyone who mattered. Deals could be questioned. Loyalties could shift. He glanced toward the event manager, then toward security, silently asking if the situation could still be contained. But something had already slipped beyond control. The little girl tugged gently at the disabled millionaire's sleeve. "Are you okay?" she asked, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The question cut through the tension like a blade, simple and impossible to ignore. He nodded slowly, meeting her eyes, and in that moment, the room felt like it was holding its breath. He opened his mouth to speak. No one knew what he was about to say. No one knew whose truth would be exposed, or what the cost would be once the silence finally broke. The only certainty was that whatever came next would change the meaning of this wedding forever. He didn't speak right away. Instead, the disabled millionaire reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, moving slowly, deliberately. The small motion sent a ripple of unease through the room. A few guests leaned back, others leaned forward. The groom's father's face drained of color as his eyes fixed on that pocket, as if he already knew what might come out of it. The maid felt her breath catch. She pulled her daughter closer, suddenly aware that this moment was no longer innocent. The paper flower lay forgotten on the man's lap now, its fragile shape resting against the dark fabric of his suit. Whatever he was about to reveal, it felt heavier than that simple gift. From his pocket, he didn't pull out papers or money, as some expected. He pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn, The image slightly faded. He held it up, not high, but just enough for the people nearest to see. A quiet murmur swept through the crowd as recognition sparked. The groom's family knew that photo. They had hoped it would never resurface. The bride frowned, stepping closer to her husband. She hadn't seen this picture before, but she sensed its weight. It showed a younger version of the disabled millionaire, standing beside the groom's father outside a modest building. Both men were smiling. In the background, a sign bore the early name of the business empire that now funded this lavish wedding. A name that, without his help, might never have existed. "He saved us," someone whispered from the crowd, the realization spreading faster now. The truth began to move on its own, no longer needing the man's voice to carry it. The groom's father shifted, anger flashing beneath his panic. He stepped forward, forcing a tight laugh, as if to brush it all aside. "This isn't the place for old stories," he said loudly, trying to reclaim control. "Today is about celebration." But the disabled millionaire's eyes never left him. Years of silence had sharpened his memory. He remembered the late-night calls, the desperate meetings, the promises of lifelong gratitude. He remembered the accident, too, and the way those calls stopped soon after. The wedding invitation had arrived years later, cold and formal, stripped of warmth. The little girl looked up at the photograph, then at her mother. "Is that him?" she asked, pointing at the younger man in the picture. Her voice was clear, curious, and impossible to silence. The maid nodded slowly, her own memories shifting. She suddenly remembered that stormy day long ago, the cafe, the stranger who had been kind without asking for anything in return. Security hesitated at the edge of the hall, unsure whether to intervene. This was no longer a simple disruption. It was turning into a public reckoning, unfolding in front of witnesses who would talk long after the wedding ended. The disabled millionaire finally raised his gaze to the groom, then to the bride. His expression wasn't angry. It was calm, almost sad. He opened his mouth again, the photograph trembling slightly in his hand. What he was about to say would not just expose a forgotten debt. It threatened to unravel reputations, alliances, and the very foundation of the celebration around them. And as the music faded completely, the room braced itself for a truth that had waited far too long to be heard. The disabled millionaire finally spoke, his voice calm but steady, carrying across the hall without effort. "I didn't come here to ruin a wedding," he said. "I came because I was invited, and because I believe some debts are bigger than money." The room stayed silent, every word landing heavy. He lifted the photograph slightly. "Years ago, when this family had nothing, they asked me for help. I gave it freely, not as a contract, but as trust." The groom's father opened his mouth to interrupt, but the man continued, his eyes never leaving him. "After my accident, that trust disappeared. Calls stopped. Promises were forgotten. I was no longer useful." A few guests lowered their heads. Others stared openly now, unable to look away. The bride's hand slipped from the groom's arm as the truth settled in. The disabled millionaire turned his gaze toward the bride. "You deserve honesty on your wedding day," he said gently, "because a marriage built on silence and pride will always crack." The groom swallowed hard, his confidence unraveling. He had grown up hearing stories of success, not sacrifice. This was the first time he understood where it truly began. The maid stood frozen, her heart racing. She never imagined her daughter's small gesture would lead here. The little girl watched quietly, holding her mother's hand, sensing the weight of the moment, even if she didn't fully understand it. Then the disabled millionaire reached for the paper flower again. He held it up, his expression softening. "This," he said, "is why I stayed silent for so long." He looked at the maid. "Your daughter reminded me of something I almost lost. That kindness doesn't vanish just because people do." He paused, letting the words sink in. Then came the moment no one expected. "I was prepared to walk away today," he said. "To forgive quietly, as I always have." A murmur rippled through the hall. "But there's one thing I can't ignore anymore." He turned toward the groom's father. "The company you built with my help still carries my name in its foundation documents. And today, I've decided to reclaim what was never meant to be taken from me." Gasps filled the room. The groom's father staggered back slightly, shock breaking through his practiced composure. Lawyers in the crowd exchanged looks. This wasn't just emotional, it was legal, real, immediate. Security stepped forward again, but the bride raised her hand, stopping them. Tears filled her eyes, not of fear, but of clarity. She looked at her husband, then at his father. "Is it true?" she asked softly. No answer came. The disabled millionaire took a breath. "I won't destroy you," he said, "but I will no longer be erased." He turned his wheelchair slightly, preparing to leave, the paper flower resting safely in his palm. As he passed the maid and her daughter, he stopped. "Thank you," he said simply. The girl smiled, proud but quiet. The guests parted without a word, watching him go, not as an ignored man in a wheelchair, but as someone who had finally been seen. And just as the doors closed behind him, the groom realized the final twist of the day wasn't the loss of money or status. It was a sudden understanding that the most powerful moment of his wedding didn't happen at the altar, but in the quiet courage of a disabled man and the innocent gesture that changed everything. The wedding never truly returned to what it was meant to be. The music didn't restart right away, and when it finally did, it sounded distant, almost hollow. Conversation stayed low and careful, as if everyone feared saying the wrong thing. The groom's family retreated into a tight circle, faces pale, forced smiles cracking under the weight of what had been revealed. For the first time, money and status couldn't buy back control. Outside the hall, the disabled millionaire paused beneath the evening lights. The air felt cooler, quieter, and easier to breathe. He sat there for a moment, alone with his thoughts, the paper flower still in his hand. He hadn't planned to speak the way he did. He hadn't planned to reclaim anything that day. But sometimes, truth finds its moment without asking permission, and once spoken, it refuses to go back into silence. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Guests talked. Whispers turned into headlines. Old documents surfaced, and long-ignored agreements were suddenly remembered. The business empire faced questions it couldn't dodge anymore. Lawyers got involved, but this time, the disabled millionaire didn't feel the need to fight with anger. He wasn't chasing revenge. He was restoring balance. And quietly, firmly, that balance began to return. The groom and bride made a choice of their own. It wasn't easy, and it didn't come without pain. But honesty, once revealed, changes people. The bride demanded transparency, not just from her husband, but from the family she had married into. The groom, shaken and humbled, began to see success differently, not as something inherited, but something earned through integrity. The wedding photos would always remind them of that turning point. The maid returned to work the next day, expecting consequences. Instead, she was called into a private office and thanked, not punished. Her quiet loyalty, her years of service, and her daughter's innocent courage had not gone unnoticed. Soon after, a new opportunity opened for her, one that offered stability instead of fear. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't feel so fragile. As for the little girl, she never understood why adults made such a fuss. She only knew that someone who looked lonely wasn't lonely anymore. The disabled millionaire visited her and her mother weeks later. He brought no grand gifts, just time. He told stories, listened carefully, and laughed more than he had in years. The paper flower was framed in place where he could see it every morning, a reminder that dignity often arrives through the smallest gestures. Life didn't magically become perfect. Healing rarely works that way. But something essential had shifted. The disabled millionaire reclaimed more than a company stake or public respect. He reclaimed his voice. The wedding guests who once ignored him carried that moment with them, a quiet lesson they couldn't unlearn. In the end, it wasn't wealth, power, or pride that changed everything. It was empathy. It was a child's honesty. It was a courage to speak when silence had gone on too long. And that is how one ignored man at a wedding, in one simple gesture from a maid's daughter, turned an ordinary celebration into a story about humanity, one that would be remembered long after the lights faded and the music stopped.